Ephesians 5, verses 8 to 14. For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what such people do secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you."
Thanks, Steve. Hey, good morning. How you doing? It's kind of starting to feel like spring, isn't it? Whew, it's awesome yesterday. Sunshine, vitamin D. So if you're with us for the very first time, welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. We're in this season of Lent. This is the fourth Sunday. We've been exploring from different angles and perspectives. This morning, I thought coming into this week, I always try to look back at my notes from months ago, the Friday before, the week before, and kind of frame it up for myself so that I can noodle on it through the weekend. And when I showed up at the office on Tuesday, I was thinking the question for this weekend was something like, how important is it to God that we trust Him? But that's the type of thing that when you say it out loud, you're like, well, you're an idiot. That's a terrible question. Of course it's important to God that you trust Him. And so by Wednesday morning, the question became, we can go to that next slide, something like this. To what extent, if any, is it your desire to grow in your ability to trust God? And I don't mean that in a patronizing way, or at least if it comes across that way, I'm sorry, it's not my intent. I recognize that not all of us here are even in this space where it is your stated desire or your felt desire. To the extent that you're here and you're just still trying to figure this Jesus thing out, or you're curious, or you're here because He's here, or you're here because, quite frankly, that used to make sense to you, but you're not sure that it does anymore. If that's you, we're thrilled that you're here. As much as we try to use Sundays and our experience in community together throughout the week to serve people and to help people grow in their relationship with Jesus and in their relationship with one another, we also very much exist for people like you, if this is you, who you're not there. You wouldn't identify as Christian, maybe you used to, but you don't anymore. And so if that's where you're at this morning, I guess I just want to say on the front end, I think it's what you get to do this morning is kind of put your feet up on the desk, so to speak, and just listen in. Because in one sense, we're going to talk about some pretty fundamental things, but in another sense, I think maybe some things that are easily taken for granted, which would leave the rest of you, those of you that do identify as a follower of Jesus in some capacity. And even here, I think it's maybe helpful before we dive in to do two things. First of all, I heard a guy do this recently, and I thought, man, that makes a lot of sense. What are a couple things you're grateful for? You just think about those. Because it might change the perspective and the experience of the whole morning. But then there's this. I was listening to some church history stuff recently, and the guy was explaining that in different seasons of the church, you had these experiences where people wanted a minimal experience of God, or in other seasons what he called a maximal experience of God. And as he was saying that, I thought, I'm not sure that I'm supposed to admit this, but I think that also explains my own personal connection with Jesus. Having started following Him somewhere around 19, 20 years old, I can look back now, even though I've worked for a church the whole time, and see there were some seasons where it was like following Jesus and being faithful and growing was like the primary focus of my life. And then I can see other seasons where, quite frankly, it was a tertiary focus. And before we jump into Psalm 23 and some other questions this morning, I just wonder, even for those of you who do identify as a follower of Jesus, if it's just helpful for you to just kind of acknowledge to yourself where you're at. Whether you're there because of some kind of existential doubt or frustration, or you're there because you've got 17 kids under 3, or just one, they'll both do the same thing. Whatever it is, like just to maybe the permission to be honest. And then for those of you who maybe you would go like, no, I think I am in this season where I'm really leaning in and things are really making sense, and I'm kind of freaking myself because I don't want to be myself out because I don't want to become a fundamentalist, and at the same time I am taking my faith more seriously. Maybe it's helpful there. To what extent, if any, is it your desire to grow in your ability to trust God? And especially what I'm focused on here, and I think what the psalm would invite us to focus on, is Are you hearing that? Yeah, thanks. To whatever extent, I don't think the focus here is academic, though Christianity can always devolve into academic trust. I think there's these questions that we could ask, like, when does a person trust God? Like, when does that matter? And maybe there's a couple things just right off the get-go that you're like, these are the issues. And I've kind of built a fence around them, and I kind of do the church thing well, but on these couple issues, if I'm being honest, there's no trust. There's just me controlling, or there's me being completely depressed and dejected, and whatever that might look like. Obviously, the psalm this week was Psalm 23, and probably it might be the most famous passage in the entire Bible. Printed on many funeral brochures, and rightly so. It's a beautiful passage, seen in many grandmothers' dining rooms. It's this very familiar passage, but it's a passage about trust. And so let's just kind of think through that for just a second. It starts this way: the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I think I've said a couple times now, I recently rememorized it in the Hebraic word order, because if you were to read it in Hebrew, which I can't do, but I can use the tools that tell me how this would have happened, it actually reads, I shall want not, my shepherd is Yahweh. Which says a couple things, I think. First of all, it assumes, doesn't it, that we all have a shepherd, though you might not call them that. We all have people we're following. We all have people we're admiring. We all have teachers. And especially in the world of Psalm 23, there were no atheists. There were gods everywhere. There were claims of God everywhere. And so the claim being made is pretty audacious. My shepherd's a good one. My shepherd's one that leads well. It's almost like everybody who's ever played soccer has had a coach. But not everybody who's ever played soccer has had a good coach. Everybody who's ever been born has had a mom, and on some level, somewhere, a dad. But not everyone who's ever been born has had a good mom and a good dad. I think if, to whatever extent you're familiar with Jesus, it's easy to take for granted that the central claim here isn't just that he's God. Lots of people in lots of places and throughout time have acknowledged there's gods. But the claim here is that this God is fundamentally good. He cares for me. He meets my needs. And then it moves into some language that's probably foreign to many of us. Next slide. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still or quiet waters. He restores my soul. I've spent a cumulative 2 minutes in my life around sheep, so I'm barely qualified. But again, I'm a good plagiarist. I can read commentaries. I can talk to people. And what I understand is, much like a human, sheep are contingent beings, which means they're pretty needy. That their ability to survive comes from outside themselves. And thus, for a sheep to lie down and consider themselves content and fulfilled is kind of a rare thing. It's a commentary about the lack of anxious soul or anxious presence. It's a commentary about when God is your shepherd, the way you show up in the world. And then the next line, this is one of my favorite lines in the entire Bible. He leads me along right paths. Go ahead to that next slide. He leads me in the right paths for his name's sake. This reminds me, I don't know if you've ever read the Chronicles of Narnia. I think I've told you that's one of part of the way that I've been steered to think about Lent is it's a season where you give things up in order to make room for other things. And so part of my deal was I want to try to read through Narnia throughout Lent, which I'm not ahead or behind, and I'm starting to get nervous if I'm going to make it all the way through the last battle, the 7th book, before it's over, but I'm at least on pace right now. If you're not familiar with it, I'm sorry. It's a series of children's books written by C.S. Lewis many, many years ago, but I just finished last week the 4th book, Prince Caspian. And there's this scene that the 4 main characters at this point in the story are Susan and Lucy and Edmund and what's the other guy's name? Peter. And they live on the planet, but then they're called to Narnia, and Narnia is the land of Aslan, the lion, or Aslan. It's kind of like Augustine. It depends on how pretentious you are, how you say it. But the idea is these kids come back and forth between these worlds. In one instance, they were brought into this world and into Narnia, and they were made kings and queens. They ruled for decades, as best I can tell. Then they went back to the planet. But one of the weird things about the story is that they might be away from Narnia back on Earth for a couple years, but like 1,000 years passed on Narnia. In other cases, they might be back on Earth for a year, and only a year passed in Narnia. So time is kind of messed up. But in one instance, Prince Caspian, who's the prince or the ruler of Narnia, he's trying to take back his reign. Things have gone very south. Those four children who are kings and queens on the planet, they've been gone for over 1,000 years. And so they call them back. Prince Caspian calls them back in an attempt to also call Aslan, this Jesus God figure, this lion figure, back. But when they come back, if you recall, they're like a long ways away from this battle, where this battle's going to happen. And so they have a pretty long day's trek to get back to the battle, and they know that time is of the essence, and so they figure out how to take the path, and they map out their route, and as they map out their route, as they follow their route, rather, they come upon a river, which they expected to see, but what they didn't anticipate is it had been like 1,000 years since they left, and so what was a river when they left is a gorge in this particular moment. It's like the Grand Canyon. It's dug itself deep into the ground. And so they spend the whole rest of the day trying to find their way down the gorge so they can cross the river and get up the other side, and they can't find a way. Eventually they come under enemy fire. They have to go into this forest. They fall asleep in the darkness of night on the forest floor. And basically the story at that point is Prince Caspian's toast because we're not going to get to him. We're not going to help. And in the middle of the night, Aslan the lion, he wakes up the youngest girl, Lucy. She goes to him, and he looks at her and he says, hey, I showed up in the middle of the day, and I told you to follow me, and you didn't. What's going on here? And she's like, well, I couldn't get them to come with me. And then again, this is just some of C.S. Lewis's genius in this book. He's like, yeah, well, that doesn't matter. You should have came anyway. It's this metaphor of the Christian life. And so he's like, I'll lead you now. And she's like, well, I got to get them. And he's like, well, either way, you got to go. And we got to go. And so she goes back to the kids, to her siblings rather. She wakes them up. They reluctantly agree to follow her. They really don't believe that she can see Aslan. Only she can see him. But if you remember the story, the way he leads her, I think, is this line in Psalm 23. Because the idea is, I've never rode my mountain bike in Moab, hope to someday. But I understand that all you can see is the next paint, like the next set of paint. And then when you get to that little paint, because you're riding on rock, and when you get to that dot, then you can see the next one. And you're just following dots, but oftentimes one at a time. Well, that's what Aslan does with these kids, with Lucy. He kind of shows up at a spot, and the idea is that she has to walk to him. And then when she gets to that spot, he's not there anymore. It's kind of like the pot of gold at the end of a rainbow kind of thing. But then he's at the next spot, and she goes to that spot. And on, and eventually he brings her up to the edge of the gorge, and sure enough, he's right next to this clear path down the gorge. It's otherwise invisible, but when you're right there, you can see it, so they go down the gorge. He leads them across the river. He leads them up the other side of the gorge. I think that's what this is talking about. And it strikes me, this actually is kind of how life works, isn't it? Like, I don't know about you, but I want to know, like, how does this resolve itself in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years? Like, what is X going to look like in the future? And it just seems like this psalmist is onto something, because what he understood was he leads me in right paths for his name's sake. And oftentimes, all we get is just the next right thing. And then the next right thing. And then there's some brutal honesty to this psalm. Next slide. Even though I walk through the darkest of valleys, I fear no evil. So here you have this psalm on grandmother's dining room wall that's all kind of flowery and perfect until it's not. It took me a while to realize that's why they've put this in the midst of Lent, because this is a very Easter, very Lent psalm. It's a very resurrection psalm. Because what we celebrate on Easter in a few weeks is this reality that because resurrection happened, there's hope. And part of what I'm hoping we can continue to just build into our psyche is it's not just humans who need resurrection. That all of creation is broken and crying out for God to rescue. And that resurrection is God's promise that he is committed to putting things back to rights. And yet, we still live in a time that's broken. This reminds me of the beginning of C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, where he says there's two equal opposite dangerous ideas a person can adopt towards evil. One is to deny its very existence, and the other is to take an unhealthy interest in it. In this psalm, there's this honest confession. We're going to do a series starting in June around prayer, and it's coming from this kind of personal study that I did where I just was like, okay, Jesus, what do you need me to know about prayer? Because it's kind of confounding and frustrating, and I don't know how it lands for you, but I'm all over the place on the way I think about prayer. And I just wanted to, like, based upon what Jesus taught and what he did as it relates to prayer, what can we learn from that? Well, one of the things that I didn't expect to see was the frequency with which he speaks to evil when he prays. The frequency with which he says things to Peter like, Peter, Satan asked to sift you like wheat, but I prayed that you would overcome. So there's this acknowledgement of evil. Many years ago, after reading John Goldingay's commentary on Genesis chapter 1, I reached out to him. It was Skype. Remember when that thing existed? And I said, could we meet? And he actually said, yeah, let's meet on Skype, which was quite honoring. And I remember I asked him, where did evil come from? And he said, the Bible never answers that question. All that it says is that it exists, what God is doing about it, and what we can do about it should we join with what God is doing. So there's this acknowledgement that on the one hand, God is good and he's a shepherd and he leads, and then there's this just confession that evil is present. It continues, for you're with me. Next slide. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Not naive to evil, not naive to pain and brokenness, aware of it, and yet somehow living within the tension. And then there's this statement, next slide, that's all about enemies. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. This is, as I understand it, to be quite honest, it's been less personal for me at this point in my life. Thankfully, I think that's a good thing, because the idea here is David, the psalmist, is confessing, God, you're my Redeemer. In the midst of enemies attacking me, so long as I'm just staying true to you, eventually they'll see your blessing in my life and they won't win. And then there's the way it resolves itself. Next slide. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. Now there's the familiar part. Now let's get into the questions. So how do we do this? Like, what is the claim? And what does it look like to live within it? Well, here's a little autobiographical piece. We can go to that next slide, Bridget. When I first saw that Psalm 23 was the psalm for the fourth Sunday in Lent, I was actually kind of bummed. And the reason was, going all the way back to last year, some of you will remember we introduced the Anglican Rosary. Going all the way back to, well, actually it was last Lent when we introduced the Anglican Rosary. We sold, not that we were making any money, but like there's over 100 of you that took us up on those. If you're going like, Rosary, what is going on here? I put the reference on the mind map. You can always find that online or in the room, and you can go listen to that message for yourself. But we talked about the Anglican Rosary, and let me just say this, like I understand it's a very foreign idea, and some of you, it kind of pushes some buttons that leave you uncomfortable, and that's fine. Here's what I would say about the Anglican Rosary. If you're in a season with your prayer life where you can just square God up and go like, God, I think I'm praying to the extent that you would have me pray, and you can do that without a rosary, sweet. Way to go. Good job. Leave it on the table. But if you're someone that is frustrated with your prayer life and wishes that you were more faithful and effective in that, then the other option would be to, frankly, swallow some of the Western evangelical pride that says we shouldn't pray with tactile objects and acknowledge that for most of Christian history, a large percentage of Christians used ropes and beads and physical things to help them pray faithfully. So the Anglican Rosary, the reason why it was bittersweet for me was the first beat of the Anglican Rosary is Psalm 23. Now, I can say with utmost integrity that I've been praying that Anglican Rosary on my walk to work Tuesday through Friday since way before last Lent. I forget exactly, but I know for sure I was doing it weekly starting in January of 2022. And I'm not trying to be braggadocious, but just to kind of set all the tension of this up. That means, you do the math. 52 weeks for well over a year, 4 times a week. Like I figure that since the start of 2022, I've prayed or recited Psalm 23, and all I do is I have my rosary in my pocket and in my head. I'm not walking down the street like a weirdo. But I figure I'm at like 250 plus times that I've started my day by reciting Psalm 23. And what I realized when I learned that it was a psalm that I'd be teaching for Lent, because we decided a long time ago we'd teach the Psalms through this, was I have kind of a love-hate relationship with it. Because quite frankly, oftentimes, and it was one of those like subconscious things I didn't realize until like had my own little therapy session right there in my own office, was this realization of like, wait a minute, sometimes when I do that, there's this tremendous guilt. Because you say things in Psalm 23, I mean, who disagrees? I mean, certainly there are people, you might be one of them, but like the beauty of Psalm 23, there's some remarkable claims being made there. And yet I'm confronted by like, Lord, I've been praying this for a year and a half, and still I missed it there yesterday, and I missed it here yesterday, and I'm not there at all emotionally. And there's this thing, and I've seen this, I've been around long enough to know that I would dare say the majority of people that I've worked with that quote-unquote deconstructed their faith or walked away from it had far more to do with their disappointment in themselves than it did God. It is possible to have these existential crises where we no longer believe, and that happens. I don't want to trivialize that. From my experience, what's way more common is this sense of like, God, I'm an embarrassment to you, so I'll exit stage left because I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but I've been trying this for 10 years and nothing's changed, so I'm out. That was kind of the emotion that I had around Psalm 23, was this like, Lord, I don't know what I would say about this. Then I was listening to a podcast. I put this on the mind map as well. It's from a guy named Esau McCauley, and we can go ahead and put that next slide up, Bridget. Thank you. He said this: Psalm 23 is the result of living the liturgy. Now, that got my attention in a big way because Psalm 23, there's some tension, and I actually really love it, but I actually am really disappointed in my ability to live it. And then you might have figured out, like, liturgy is something that I'm really curious about right now, and I'm trying to understand. And, liturgy, we don't have time to do a whole message around it, and I'm not really an expert on it, but in one sense, liturgy in the technical sense means that which we do together. There's a whole conversation that we'll have at some point with respect to Sunday morning in that sense. But practically, a liturgy is just a routine. It's a set of habits. So I found his statement really, really intriguing. Psalm 23 is the result of living the liturgy. So I emailed him. I've learned over the years, sometimes people email you back, and I emailed him and kind of referenced the podcast and put this quote in there, and I was like, thank you for that. Could you unpack that a little more for me? And to his credit, he emailed me back, and he said, no. It was like literally his response. He's like, no, I can't right now. I'm sorry. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I have to respect you for emailing me back. So like me, I'm leaving you this morning a little bit to just contemplate, what does that mean? Here's where I'm at. Let me ask you this question. What's the liturgy of a marathon runner? Now, we don't have to necessarily line out what it is and delineate it. But especially if the said marathon runner is not 17 and can get off the couch and go run a marathon without trying, let's just say the marathon runner is more like 40 and suddenly his knees hurt or something, couldn't we all agree that if you're legitimately someone who can run 26.2 miles with some regularity, there's a whole set of habits that make that possible for you? Would we agree on that? Yeah. What's the liturgy of like a really good high school teacher? Again, there's people here that could speak to that. Shannon could speak to that. But we don't have to necessarily delineate what they are. But could we agree that the difference between a really good one and a really mediocre or even bad one has to do with a series of habits and commitments and sacrifices? Make sense? What's the liturgy of someone who trusts to the level of Psalm 23? See, I've always thought of Psalm 23 as something that's pulling me forward, like that's pulling me into itself. I've never thought of it before as a reflection, which I think Esau's right. This is somebody who's living a certain way, who has certain habits in place, certain disciplines, certain commitments, and what he's doing is basking in the fruit of that what he calls liturgy. When do we need to trust God? Well, it's fundamentally in the present moment, isn't it? Like, you might have used to be a marathon runner, and you might someday be one, but if you're living the liturgy, you are one, which means there's things you're doing in the moment, in the present tense. So here's my question, and frankly, I think it's a little uncomfortable, but what's your liturgy? Like what is the system that you've put in place and that I've put in place? See, what's helped me is to go like, you can live in the frustration, Adam, of you keep coming back to Psalm 23 and you're ashamed and embarrassed and a little frustrated at the lack of doing it in your life. But if you think back to what those claims are, like those claims, they represent a very present state of mind, a very consistent set of behaviors. See, part of what we know about the liturgy of a marathon runner is by the nature of that being one of their commitments, they don't have very many liturgies. If you're committed to being a marathon runner, like there's a lot of things you frankly don't have time for because they don't fit with these things that very much are your priority. We know this about great employees, like a great high school teacher. There's certain things that you don't have time for. See, here's my wrestling match, and I hope you know that it's authentic and it's real for me on a pretty continuous basis, because I feel like we started this church called Narrate, and the premise of our existence together was like following Jesus is easy. Why would you not do this? And what's got me messed up right now is I don't think I believe that anymore. I don't think it is easy. I think to be a faithful follower of Jesus who can recite Psalm 23 is akin to becoming a marathon runner, or being a great high school teacher, or being in shape, or any number of other things that we know, like there's lots of opportunities, but we only have time for so much. So what if Psalm 23 is an invitation? And the invitation is, should you build your life around this being the desire and put a set of practices in place that make it reality, then it just might happen for you. I realize that I'm leaving a little vague this morning to ask this question of like, what's your liturgy? I will say this, for someone like me or the rest of the staff, or probably even chances are people in your own life right now, like there's genuinely not a more exciting conversation to have with someone than to sit down and go like, hey, so how do I build a personal liturgy? How do I put together practices and habits that'll actually help me live in this direction? So I volunteer myself, the entire staff, and whatever friends or Christian community you have. Like, on the one hand, it's a daunting enterprise, perhaps. On the other hand, any of us would love to help with that. But what is it? And what are the things that should you return to them with some consistency would draw you in to making this a reality? You know, as the band comes back up here, we're going to give you a chance to take communion, but I think, for me, I just want to take you back to that opening question. To what extent is it your desire to trust him more? And can we just say, like, if you're kind of like, God, I don't know that I have time for anything more than I have right now, or I'm not interested in anything more, I think part of what it means to not speak the Lord's name in vain, so to speak, is just to be honest with where you're at. And if you're someone that's in this season where you're checking things out, that's okay. Continue to check things out. But if you're someone that's like, no, this is like the desire of my guts right now. This is what I'm working on. Then maybe there's this conversation of like, okay, Lord, so who's the personal trainer that I need to get with that can help me put this thing together? And again, myself, Hannah, Justin, Lexi, Gay, the staff can help with this. Also, there's probably someone already in your sphere of influence who can help. And so any of those are options. If you're a guest with us this morning or new to the way we have organized Sundays, we are taking communion every week, which means we'll have elements. We'll have bread over here and wine over here, and there are gluten-free options and grape juice options. And as far as like who qualifies, let me just say, like, if you're actively following Jesus, by all means, please come take communion with us. If you've not been baptized, I do think there's some importance to that, and we'd love to have that conversation. But Don't let that keep you from taking communion. And then also there's this reminder that part of the design of this time is just to invite God to speak into your stuff, and especially to live within the liberation of sins forgiven, sickness healed. So it can be a helpful time to take some inventory that way, though we hate to turn it into any kind of treadmill. But the advantage of using this time to do that is also then that you get to sit within the tangible, tactile sense of forgiven. And yet God still wants to hear you ask. So let me pray, and we'll let you jump into that. God, thanks. Thanks for people like David who apparently lived this life that led him to this incredible confession of Psalm 23. And thanks, God, that you invite us to build towards a similar goal and similar end. And God, thanks for this time of communion. Lord, we know that the design of our life and our calling is that you would take our ordinary everyday lives, infuse them with your presence and your spirit, and use them to serve those around us. And God, we just quite frankly recognize that there's this deep mystery to communion, that you offer it as spiritual food for us in ways that words can't express. And so we ask in the same way that you'd send your spirit into this bread and wine and make it spiritual manna for us, that we could tangibly know and receive your forgiveness and the food of your kingdom. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.